All right, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, we just finished one of the topics Paul was going through. What can we summarize as sort of the last big thrust of his point in chapter 10? What was the last main topic he was dealing with? So meat that had been offered to idols was the topic of sort of surrounding the last couple chapters. What was his sort of concluding point on that topic? Don't offend others. Be concerned with the well-being, the conscience of others, and do all to the glory of God. So at the beginning of chapter 11, he says, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. And I'm not entirely sure if that verse is more about the previous topic or more about the upcoming topic, or maybe it's a little bit of both. But the point's still a pretty important one. He's saying that I am an example that you can look to of how you're supposed to conduct yourself, of how you are to live for Christ in a Christly way, but realize that that's a useful example only insofar as I actually do look like Christ. If you see something that I'm doing that's not in line with what Christ said and did, well, then that's not something you should be imitating. But if there's something that is in line with Christ's teaching, here's a practical, real-life example of what that looks like. So, in verse 2, I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the traditions just as I delivered them to you. What are the traditions that he's talking about? What does that mean? I think we typically have a particular idea in mind when we hear that term. What is he saying to them? What are the traditions? John?
I think in the way we use the word, it often means things we're in the habit of doing, but are not necessarily that you could take them or leave them, but it's the way we're used to doing them. In 2 Thessalonians 2, 14 and 15, Paul more clearly writes to the Thessalonians that the traditions that they received are actually aspects of doctrine. It's not just his opinion or their habits. It's basically the gospel. And so if he's using it in a similar way here, then it's probably carries more weight than we might give it on first pass.
So when we talk about tradition, we're typically saying that this is a habit that we have that's not the same thing as a commandment or a doctrine. But Paul has clarified sometimes in other places that the traditions they were delivered were the gospel. They were the doctrine of Christ that had been delivered to them. And if that's the way he's using it here, he's saying you've received the proper instruction on what the gospel is. And keep in mind, the Bible, the New Testament as we have it, is not written yet. They're receiving these things from teaching, from letters, and eventually it becomes the Bible that we have. So likely that's what he's talking about. You're keeping the commandments, or many of the commandments that have been delivered to you. I think also when we talk about tradition, we think about Jesus in particular, teaching as, I hope it's Jesus, I hope I'm not misquoting it, but teaching as, I'm getting it wrong, this is awful. Teaching as doctrine the commandments of, someone else help me. Teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. That they've got the traditions that they've built up, the Pharisees and scribes, they've got the traditions they've built up, and they're teaching those as commandments that must be followed. And oftentimes then we take that idea of what a tradition is and we impose it whenever we see the word. Here, I think, again, Paul's talking about what the actual gospel is. Now, I saw some conflicting ideas on the context of verse 2. We see that Paul sometimes uses sarcasm, and some people I looked at suggested that this was a sarcastic verse because we know that there were issues where people didn't remember Paul. They didn't pay attention or heed Paul. They thought he was someone that needed to be discounted. And we also know that there's several different issues where they're having trouble following their purpose as Christians. They've forgotten their purpose in the gospel. So I'm not sure if this is supposed to be sort of a backbiting remark against them, something to sort of chastise them, or if he's being sincere that there's a lot of the commandment you've received that you are doing a good job of following. I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if anyone has an opinion either way on that. But in either case, he's saying there is proper conduct that should be expected of you. And he's saying, at least I want to praise you in those things if you are following them. And he uses that as a transition into this next topic. And this could be a tricky one we're going to have to work together through as we go through these verses. In verses 3 through 6, I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. All right, so he started off in the previous verse that you remember the traditions. You keep the things that were delivered to you. And then he transitions into this particular topic. So I'm assuming that this is another thing that they've brought to his attention, another thing that there have been some questions about. What does he start off with as he transitions into the specific topic that he's addressing? What is the first principle he brings forth? He brings forth the idea of authority, of headship. So the head of every man is Christ. So the person who has authority, the person who is in the leadership role, who has headship, is Christ over man. He says the head of woman is man. What does that one mean? Same thing the former one meant, that there is an authority structure between woman and man. Now, what is the scope of that? It's a weird way to ask it. I'm asking a mind-reading question. What is the scope of that? All women are subservient to all men? Or under the headship of all men? Marriage. I think marriage and possibly the parental relationship are probably the two things that are in mind here. That a woman, in the proper structure that God has put forth, has a head. Either children as a whole, their head is their father, their child relationship to their parent, or in marriage, a wife has a head in the husband, that there is a level of authority established there. And then after that, he puts forth that the head of Christ is God. What's that? Go ahead. The same thing the other two meant. There is this headship, this idea of authority within the nature of God as well. That God the Father has headship over Christ, over God the Son. What lesson or idea can we take from that? How does that idea help us understand which is going to be the core of this, the man and woman relationship? What insight does that give? I'll have to ask leading questions. Oh, go ahead. Scott?
Well, the fact is there is authority. The fact is there must be submission. The fact is that Christ readily accepted his relationship to God the Father. And therefore, as Bill said, as these things are, so are the other things. In a marriage relationship, the wife must willingly submit to the headship of the husband. The man must willingly submit to the headship of Christ. And so it's not one better than the other, it's just that this is the way it is. And that also means the man must be the leader in the family. And if the woman fails to submit and the man fails to lead, then they're both out of whack.
So the idea of authority is something that God has built into these relationships. That it's something that's expected. It's something that exists and must be, again, respected. And we see the example of a willing submission, a willing subjection to this headship and to this authority. And that's why I think the example of Christ, his head being God, is really important there, because Christ is not inferior to God. This idea of authority and subjection is not a statement on relative worth, is not a statement on greater and inferior quality, because Christ and God are equal, and yet there's still authority within the relationship. And there is a willing subjection. Christ is not resentful about the authority structure between him and the Father. That's something he willingly accepted and was obedient to. And so the idea of both a man, a husband, in his subservience to Christ, and a wife being subservience, being under the headship of both Christ and of her husband, both of those things are supposed to be willing relationships. And so really the example of Christ and God is the one that we should all look to as the model for the others that are listed here. The relationships that involve the mortal should look like the spiritual. So with that concept in mind, with that basic starting point of what the authority structure is to look like, he goes on to this next topic. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. Every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, and he likens it to being shaved. So, now's where things probably get a little bit trickier. What is the principle he's putting forth? Yeah, Scott.
The man failing to accept his role as a leader in the relationship with his wife is a disgrace, just as the woman in the marriage relationship failing to accept her submissive role is also a bad thing. That's the way I see it. It's still talking about authority.
So Scott's pointing to, I think, a conclusion we draw from this, that the man is supposed to have his proper role as leader, as head in his family. And if he's not fulfilling that role, it's disgraceful. And a wife, if she's not fulfilling her proper role, and she's not willing to be subjective, willing to be submissive in that relationship, she's also being disgraceful, dishonoring. So that's an interpretation we can apply onto this. The subject matter, though, or the exact topic being talked about, is dealing with a head covering. So sometimes that's translated as a veil. That's not a face thing from my understanding. It's just the head covering, like a shawl. And he's saying that a man having on a shawl is something that's dishonorable, and a woman having her shawl off while talking about praying and prophesying is also dishonorable. So this is a topic where we get into it, and we often end up concluding that it's a cultural element. This is something to do with the culture of the day. And at my current understanding, I think that's where I also fall, but I think we should be careful and patient when we're willing to try to make that claim. Because it's easy to look at something and go, oh, that's just a relic of the time, we don't have to worry about it. We need to understand that all of the things that are presented here, even if there are cultural elements, the principle being taught is still just as applicable today. If we look back at chapter 10, we're talking about meat being offered to idols. That's technically a cultural element. We don't really have that problem these days as far as I'm aware. But the principle that we dealt with was recognizing that my liberty is not as important as the conscience of my brother, and recognizing that I shouldn't be casual about possibly searing my own conscience. That principle very much still applies today. So when we're talking about this, we need to understand the cultural element, but not readily just say, hey, this application does or does not apply to us today. So, anyone that might know about the culture of the time, what do you know about the idea of head coverings? Because I think we do need to understand the cultural import to help better understand this. And really, Paul tells us some of the principle there. What's the deal with a head covering? I guess we'll see that in a few verses, so that's not what I was thinking of. What does it represent? What is the indication? It represents submission. We see in a little bit that it's mentioned or called a symbol of authority in some translations. So it was representative of being under the submission and under the protection of someone else. So women almost always had them because they were either under a parent or under a husband. And it represented, among their culture, proper order. Hey, this person is under the protection, in submission to someone else. And so he says that any man that prays with his head covered, so again, this idea of having the covering, having on a veil, dishonors his head. I think Scott already alluded to that, but why is that? What does that mean? Why would that be a dishonor? Because he's declaring, I'm in subjection to another. I'm under someone else. I'm not the one that has any level of authority here. I'm not taking leadership. Now, I think there are contexts where some people would have those sorts of veils because they were in subservience to a god. But he's saying that this is basically a practice that's not looked upon well. It's unfavorable. It's something that's dishonorable. Really, it's something that's looked upon, I think, as being feminine. You're taking on a more female role by giving up authority, by saying, I'm not the one in authority. So when you look at the other, a woman who prophesies with her head not covered, she doesn't have the veil on. And that indicates something similar. She's saying, I'm not under someone's authority. I'm not in subjection to someone else. We realize if there is this authority inherent in these relationships, then she's stepping outside her role. I've had in a few other studies I've heard talked about how there were some cultural movements that were sort of similar to what we think of feminism today. I think Luke Walker once told me about the New Roman Woman was a cultural movement of women that said, I don't need a man. I don't need to be under anyone else. I take care of myself. And it was basically an idea of a little bit of rebellion. I'm rebelling against this cultural norm. I'm standing up on my own. I'm not going to be under a man. And I think that idea might be partly in play here. He also goes into verse 6 saying if she's not going to wear the covering, if she's not going to show the typical sign of being under authority, of being in the submissive role as God's really ordained, he says let her be shaved. So if she's going to not have the head covering, might as well just shave her hair off too. What implications does that have? Again, I think it's a cultural element we need to understand about that. Yeah, John?
If she's not going to be under the man, then she should go ahead and kind of play all her cards, go ahead and take it to the full length. If she's not going to be under the man by not wearing a veil, then she might as well take on the role of a male. And again, kind of cultural application would be go ahead and shave your head, have short hair like a parent. And there's some issues of what's actually culture in some of these and what is not. It's not always clear, but I think that's the idea. If you're going to not accept the authority of the man, then go ahead and take on the full appearance.
So if you're not going to accept the authority, then fully commit to it. Get short hair, conduct yourself, look like a man, conduct yourself like a man. Just fully commit to it. A thing that I've heard repeatedly, I suppose I don't know how to research it beyond seeing what the other books say, but apparently women that didn't have on coverings and women that had shaved heads, that was pretty common among prostitutes. And we've already talked before about among the Corinthians, among the Greek culture, prostitutes were a common thing among the temples. And really, women were either long hair and using their head coverings to show subjection, or if they didn't have that, most likely they were a temple prostitute. And so he's saying, commit to the part. I don't think he's telling them go ahead and go be prostitutes, but you're being rebellious in the same way, that they're being rebellious, so you might as well look the same. You might as well make it so people have a hard time distinguishing the two. Really, I think at that point, he's saying you're rebelling in the same way as them. You're standing up against the authority that God has instructed you to follow. So let's look in verse 7. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So the first, he's giving another principle behind this topic. And what's the principle he's establishing? It's still the idea of authority, but he's getting there a different way. Or I guess he's explaining how you got there. John?
I think the phrase that I've read or heard somewhere that helps me, particularly in verse 9, is that the roles that he's been talking about, the roles are by creation, not by culture. So the concept of authority, he's talking about how it may play out in their culture, but the principle of authority is based on creation because Adam was created first and the woman was created from Adam. He makes the same application in 1 Timothy 2 when he talks about the woman's role in teaching, that you should have authority over the man because Adam was created first and then Eve. So I think that's the principle that it's based, his argument on authority is based on the creation order of God, not on cultural deviations.
The reason for the authority, besides the fact that God ordained it, he points back to creation. That the way God created and the intent behind God's creation is where that authority started. That's where it derived from. That woman was created to be a helper, to be a support to man. And that's what marriage was, the first really establishment that God put in place. That relationship was from the very beginning. And so these verses are pointing back to that regardless of the way culture shifts, regardless of the way cultural norms shift, this relationship and the headship inherent in it was a preordained thing. That's the way God has always wanted it to be. So, verse 10's the tricky one that maybe we just gloss over, but for this reason, for remembering the importance of authority, even from God's beginning of his creation, women should have the symbol of authority. So he's saying women should be in subjection. Andrew. Andrew brings up a good point that also stirs the pot a little bit, but pointing out that the context we're dealing with when he's dealing with these ideas, the principle of authority extends to the entire relationship. The principle of this head covering in particular is dealing with the idea of both prophesying and praying. And that seems to be a public thing, that if a man is in public prophesying before people, or if he's praying before people, then there's a conduct to be had. Or if this woman is prophesying or praying before the people, then she's supposed to have this other conduct. So that is important to remember as we're talking about this particular topic. So he deals with the principle of authority, just this is what the relationship looks like, and then goes back to this specific context and says, so therefore the woman should have the symbol of authority. I think what that indicates is that wearing the proper clothing that they had was an indication of the heart, an indication of the character of the person. And so if this woman is prophesying, is praying before the others, they want them to understand that she's not being rebellious. She's not moving outside and taking authority over her husband, usurping his authority. While doing that, if she is prophesying miraculously from God, but she's still wearing the thing that indicates that she's in subjection to her husband, you're trusting. You have better trust that her motives are pure. Better trust that she's not, again, trying to make a name for herself. She's conducting herself rightly before God. And then the last part of that says she should be conducting herself rightly. She should be wearing the thing that shows proper conduct and a proper heart because of the angels. I really don't know what that means. I think there's some element saying that angels do observe what we do. This seems to be part of it, that if you have the improper conduct or you have the proper conduct, there are angels that witness that, and that adds really some heavenly import to the things that we're doing. Eric? If I understood your connection properly, you're saying that when you're prophesying, when there's this miraculous deliverance of God's word, you're a messenger of God. And so you should be like the angels in that you should conduct yourself with proper decorum so that the message is delivered rightly. Is that your... Okay, good. Do you have a point, Scott?
Well, just similar to that angels had roles to do, and they had to be in submission. And I think we do read somewhere where some angels left their primary purpose and they were condemned for that. I'd like to make another point while I have an opportunity. What we're talking about here is not the Sunday Optimist Club. We're talking about Christians. We're talking about the church that God sent his son to buy and redeem by his own blood. We're not talking about some humanly organization here. We're talking about that which is given by God for the very purpose of redeeming us from sin. And we need to recognize that, and all of us probably are subject, or susceptible is a better word, to the wokeism of our day. I know I have been at times in my life. There have been times that I didn't want to step on toes, or I didn't want to exert authority when I should have. And we just got to be really careful. We have to accept our roles, whether we like it or not. And whether it offends people in my workplace, if I have a role to do in my home and my family, I've got to do it. And I've got to just be careful about that I don't give into it and be more woke than God wants me to be.
So a reminder that what we're called to is holiness. We're called to follow after the ways of Christ. And as we see in Corinthians, there were a lot of cultural things that influenced them that they needed to abstain from. They needed to be different. And our culture today is the same way. There are many influences, many things that we're expected to approve of, expected to conduct ourselves in a certain way, but we're called to follow God's way. We're called to follow God's example of holiness, regardless of what the cultural pressures are. So we'll leave the because of the angels thing. We'll just let some of those ideas simmer, and we'll keep going on. Verse 11, nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. What does this section add to the discourse? Andy?
Well, I was feeling pretty important before we got to here. You know, it's not eliminating the significance or the codependence, or interdependence, I think is a better word, of man and women. And I start thinking about passages where Paul talks about fellow heirs of the promise. I think back to Genesis 1 where God created them in his image, both male and female. It says that we're still connected. We can't go without each other.
Paul's offering really a balancing aspect, a thing to understand so that people don't teeter off and misuse what he's already spoken on, saying that there's this authority structure, but that doesn't mean one is lesser. He already covered that point, but he's re-emphasizing it here, that man just as much depends on woman. And he said interdependence of that relationship. And it's an important thing to remember, so that the men are just listening to this going, yeah, women need to be in subjection. I'm the ruler. I get to do what I want. Well, we've already talked about that idea other places, but the example of God in Christ is an important one to remember for both sides of that relationship. So he reminds them of that there's a connection between the two. Verse 13, judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So leave verse 16 off for a moment. Looking at the others, he's now sort of summing up the topic, saying they should judge for themselves. Like, look to the things that you know, look to the things that you understand. Are these questions hard for you to answer? So is it proper for a woman to pray with her head uncovered? And I think the idea is sort of a rhetorical question, that no, we know from the way that all of us live, that that's not proper. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a dishonor to him? What's that about? Are we specifically targeting hippies? What is that about? I didn't mean to look at you, Jake. I'm sorry. Male pattern baldness? Maybe. I actually don't know when that arose genetically, but could be. So what's the idea there? John?
A couple of ideas. One is, need to kind of define what nature is. I mean, is he talking about the natural world? You know, if we look at the natural world, lions, actually the males have more hair than the female does. If we look at birds, the male is often the more decorated, beautiful, colored of the species. I'm not sure that the natural, so I can't see the natural world necessarily fitting in. So nature then may be referring to culture or what you're used to, you know, from an environmental standpoint. I think that may make more sense. And if that's the case, then you know, it could refer to local customs. It could refer to national customs. You know, what is the norm for your human environment? And to me, it seems to make more sense that he's talking about that it's something that they're used to, that he's expecting them to draw a natural conclusion from. I'm not sure that I see that even in our custom or culture today, that's necessarily true. And there are even things like the Nazarite Vow from the Old Testament, where the man was forbidden to shave his hair for a period of time. Some people had the Nazarite Vow for their whole lives. If this means that this is something that's universal, then the Nazarite Vow would have been something that would have been shameful. And that doesn't seem to make sense. John the Baptist was a Nazarite. So it seems that it has to be, at least from my perspective, and I'm very glad to hear other thoughts, seems like it's referring to something that they, in their culture, in their current environment in Corinth, it would be natural for them to draw conclusions from, which may be different than the environment that we're in that we might draw conclusions from.
So John points out that when he says nature, it likely doesn't mean biological. It doesn't mean just the natural world as a whole, because different animals have very different dimorphisms. And when you're dealing with people, there's not really a major biological reason in most cases, but he's saying more of what's natural, what's common, most likely. And I think it's the case that nearly every culture throughout human history, men typically had shorter hair than women. Like the actual lengths of hair that people are doing varies. I think we have much shorter hair on average now than they probably did at the time. But even then, men typically have shorter hair than women. That's just the way almost every culture seems to establish. And so, what he's pointing here is, you know that this is a common thing. Now, John also pointed out that there's the Nazarite vow. That's an example where men would specifically not get haircuts. Their hair would grow out. And if it were entirely a completely dishonorable and wrong thing to do, then that would be an improper vow to hold. And that doesn't seem to be the case. That's something that was looked favorably upon. And we also know that Paul even had a vow that eventually he got his hair cut afterwards. So Paul at some point had at least somewhat longer hair too. But he's saying here's the normal order of things, and my current leaning is saying here's the normal cultural expectation of things. This is what is normally seen, and it's you fulfilling your normal cultural role. Scott?
In the past 3 years, I've thought a lot about some passages of Scripture. One of them is in Ephesians talking about putting on the armor of God, and it begins with girding your loins with truth. And I thought about that a lot, and I thought about we have to come to the realization that our bodies are what they are. We are who we are by birth. I have to accept the fact that I'm a man, and my body is not given for my pleasure. My body is given for a purpose, and that purpose is to please God. And if I have a family, to love my family, to love my wife, to love my kids. That's the purpose of my body. So if I gird my loins with truth, everything about me is I'm a man of God. And everything filters down from that. But when that gets out of whack, then things fall apart. I see myself and my body as whatever I want it to be, and it's for my pleasure or it's for my purposes. And I think maybe even this is related to what we're talking about here, is that we have a purpose given by God to be a man or to be a woman, and we need to step up and fill those roles. I don't know. I'm just brainstorming here, but I think that they're related, and I think that I've had long hair, and my dad used to say, "Scott, get your hair cut. I can't tell if you're a man or a woman." I said, "Come on, Dad. You know I'm a man, and everybody around me knows I'm a man." But I think there may be a time when we have to just accept our roles, and if God says the hair is a symbol of authority in a culture that I live, maybe then I just need to bear up and do it.
So Scott points out that we have roles. We have roles that are given by God, and it's our duty to fulfill those roles, to conduct ourselves in line with those things. And what we've already seen in the past chapters is that what I'm allowed to do, what I'm able to do, and it would be technically okay, isn't as important as how it influences others and influences my own heart. That's a more important consideration than what I'm allowed to do. And so in this topic, that could well be part of it. Maybe this is getting away from the topic slightly, but I think about the way your conduct reflects on other people, or how your conduct reflects on you in the eyes of other people. Things like the clothing that we wear, as long as it's modest, there's not really a big deal. But we have cultural ideas attached to that, where if someone has baggy, jagged clothing, they've got chains that they're wearing, and it's all black clothing, like that person would look out of place, at least in my historical, the way I remember things, we would think that's weird if a person like that walked into church. And it shouldn't be something that's looked upon disfavorably. It's something we should be able to look past for sure, but that is a thing that could go poorly. It's the same reason that I wouldn't wear jeans on a Sunday to come up here before the Lord's table. Jeans don't mean anything, but there's at least a residual cultural belief around them that it's better to err on the side of those who would be offended by seeing that than for me saying, I'm allowed to wear jeans, I can do what I want. I think, Bill, you had your hand up?
Yeah, what you're describing again is 10, 23, 24, which chapter 8, 9, 10 doesn't hinge on.
Yeah. So back to 1 Corinthians 10, that's the key idea that was behind that. The idea of caring about what brothers are seeing in me, that all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. And I think that both the proximity to that section, or I think the proximity of that section could well influence what we're talking about. That this idea well plays into that same principle, that what is lawful isn't always helpful. The verse that's, I think, interesting, or adds extra interest to this, is verse 16. But if anyone seems to be contentious, We have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Thoughts? That verse is interesting to me because it's very easy to make that say what you want it to say. If you think that the head covering absolutely does not matter anymore, then it's very easy to say that the custom he's talking about is we've got no custom regarding head coverings, so don't be contentious about it. I think it's very easy if you're on the opposite side to say that the custom he's talking about is being contentious. We don't be contentious about such things. We follow God's authority, and that's what he's saying. I'm not exactly sure the best way to look at that because it's colored by my own perceptions. What do people think? If anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God.
Are traditions physical manifestations of something, whereas authority is something that we all have to be in authority? But traditions are things that we physically do. We assemble, we do this, we do that, we wear hair, we dress a certain way.
So Scott's saying that there are customs, there are things that we do that are just our traditional way of doing things. Again, using the one version of the word tradition that we use. But the principles are obviously core, the things that we have to keep adhering to. And so, in your view, the custom he's talking about is the veil in particular, the head covering in particular is just a custom, but all these principles of authority are still vitally important to understand. Joe?
I looked at the net, I just pulled it up, and it says, if anyone intends to quarrel about this, we have no other practices, or do the churches of God.
We have no other practices.
So I don't know, I mean, it's kind of lays down what he said before down through here, and we don't have any other practices other than what he talked about. I mean, I don't know.
So in the one that Joe looked up, it said, if anyone wants to quarrel about this, we and the churches of God have no other custom. So in that portrayal of it, it's saying that this is the only way that we do it among the church. Yeah? Dan, I think? So the idea that we don't want this to be a point of contention, and we're going to lead into an issue where there have been divisions, where there is disunity in the next topic that we're going to deal with. And he's reminding them, don't let this become a point of contention. Don't let this be a conflict that arises. We're almost out of time. We got like 1 minute, it looks like, on my clock. The idea that just being contentious is the thing that churches don't have a custom of, I mean, that's true. It's not contention isn't supposed to be a factor among the church. So I don't think the custom he's talking about is just, hey, we don't fight, and so you shouldn't be fighting because there's no custom of fighting in the church. But as Joe pointed out, the translation can vary a little bit. There's a little bit of ambiguity in which way you portray it. I think an important thing to take away as we digest that topic more is that it was still applying to this idea of prophesying and praying. And Eric alluded to that this might be due to miraculous gifts in particular, so the prayer was likely also a miraculous gift. And so in those contexts, a woman who was basically in front of people and presenting, she was taking a position that looked like having authority, but she was still conducting herself under the proper headship. She was showing, I'm not rebelling against my husband. I'm still in subjection to him, even though I'm speaking before you right now in this miraculous way. If we're not dealing with that particular topic, that particular instance, then the principle here doesn't seem to apply as much, even though all of the lessons he's given about authority are still really important to understand. And as Scott pointed out, we do have roles given by God to fulfill, and it's our responsibility to fulfill them. All right, come Wednesday, we'll finish chapter 11. which half of that's the Lord's Supper, so maybe that makes it easier, maybe not. And we'll also go through chapter 12. Thank you, guys.